All right, let's move on to our final presentation this morning. This is going to be given by Bob Bindschadler, who is coming out of retirement to enlighten us on an important component of Search's new plans. This is the knowledge to action component, but I think for most of us that's kind of a fuzzy concept. And so Bob's task here is to really explain this in terms we can understand and spur some discussion about what form that'll take in the next 5 years.
Mark, I'm going to disagree with you. We have to fight it. We have to do it differently. And I'm going to start by reminding us why we're here talking about the Arctic. And I'm going to remind you why there is a national policy for the Arctic and why IARPC has been raised from the dead, almost, bureaucratic dead. It's because national assets are at risk. It's not because people like Arctic science. It's because Arctic science has become incredibly important now. Those national assets include businesses, there's economic interests at risk, communities, there are communities at risk, there's even national security at risk. That's why we're here. So the landscape has completely changed, not only the physical landscape, but the political landscape and the research landscape has to change in response to that. So this knowledge to action item is in my view, incredibly important. It's the only reason that I don't just retreat back to retirement. In the Arctic, it is so important that this change to the research environment happens. There's too much at risk not to change. So let me frame that. I guess I kind of did just now. Contemporary change is causing problems in the Arctic. I just mentioned a number of them. We can alleviate a lot of those problems with actions at all these different scales, local, national, regional, even international scales. But those actions need to be well informed. And that knowledge speaks to appropriate actions both in the dimensions of feasibility and effectiveness. Without that knowledge, we're just guessing, and that's not the way we can be smarter than that. And the research, of course, is the way to acquire that knowledge. This is how I see the whole issue. But in the Arctic in particular, the pace of change is so rapid that those actions are needed yesterday. That's why we're here, right? And so research has to accept that. And we can't just do research with a business as usual attitude. It can't just be posing your hypothesis, getting your grant money, collecting your data, writing your papers, and the data disappear. That just won't work anymore. That's not what we're being asked to by our national government. So the research has to be better integrated. It has to be identified and implemented. The knowledge has to be acquired quickly. It has to be that type of research because that knowledge is needed right now to take the necessary actions. That's how I frame this knowledge to action. It's different. It's different now in the Arctic. Just to remind you of what I would say is the traditional scientific research approach, sort of the business as usual approach. You have a plan that's hypothesis driven. Sometimes it's just curiosity driven. You're just, as a scientist, you're interested in something and you make a case to get some funding and you go off and you do that and you sort of, you scratch that scientific itch that you have. Collect your data, do your analysis, your testing, your validation, you write your paper. But we really have to ask ourselves this question at the bottom. How well is that working for dealing with Arctic change? And I think you know what my answer is. So I came to Search sort of in midstream. Search was already in existence. And I was taught that they had these three pillars, these three stools of three legs of the stool. But in my assessment, I felt this was a better pictorial of where Search was. And they admitted as much in my early discussions on the SSC. The Observing Change Panel, the Understanding Change Panel, they kind of knew their task, they were doing well. The Responding to Change Panel, not doing as well. And I think that's still the case. because this knowledge to action issue has been poorly addressed. So, knowledge to action, a couple of other comments about it. The science still advances without fully embracing and engaging in knowledge to action. But society doesn't benefit. We learn more, we discover some interesting things, but society really doesn't reap any benefit from that. And ultimately, they're paying for it. They've been paying for it all along. So this knowledge to action really requires a completeness that generally has not been achieved, not just in the Arctic. I came to the search, as I said this morning, from the Antarctic, and we've had some successes and some failures and weaknesses there too. And I think we don't particularly perform well in this arena either. But in the Arctic, we have to do better. And as I say here, this urgent need for informed action in the Arctic has really highlighted this weakness. And we've discussed it a lot on the SSC, and I think we've tried to, in our proposal to NSF, and this new strategy that we're introducing you to here today, really tries to emphasize this particular leg of the stool. I will say, because we've just heard about ACATUS, that knowledge to action, if you search on the web, you find a lot of different uses of that term. And some people will refer to it simply as making large data sets available to scientists to do their science. I'm not talking about it in that sense. It's something more inclusive in terms of incorporating stakeholders in the actual scientific enterprise. So I say it here. Here it's about constructing these direct links between the researchers and the stakeholders through mutual involvement in the research and application enterprises. And this has to increase the impact of scientific research. It has to. So here's a fairly bold statement that I will stand behind, that the knowledge to action will fail if it's limited to the handoff of knowledge at the conclusion of the scientific research when you're writing your papers, and when decision-making process is looking for that information. That's how we do it now, and it doesn't work well. I think we have to admit that it does not work well. We need to do it differently. And again, we see with search and the situation in the Arctic an opportunity to do it better, and the need to do it better. The urgency is there. So I'll go back to this sort of template here of scientific research and say the way we see this happening is that there will be this knowledge exchange between the stakeholders, between the interested parties and the scientists, not at the tail end, not at right sort of post-communication, but throughout this whole process. There needs to be exchange of information, interests, or sort of sanity check. Are we doing the right work from the get-go, from the planning stage? That's different. That's different than the way you do science now. So, just sort of pulling that apart and looking at some of the different phases of that template of scientific research. Oh, I don't get there yet. Knowledge exchange. So that's sort of another different term. I think it's fairly well self-descriptive. Involves sharing knowledge across the spectrum of participants, not just the scientists. It's kind of Arctic science has become too important to be left to just Arctic scientists alone. That's another way I sort of think of it. So scientists, agency representatives, local residents, businesses that have commercial interests up there, fisheries, food security, it all is in play. But that makes it more difficult. The more diverse the players and the more varied the forms of knowledge, talked a little bit about this with ACATUS, the more difficult this becomes. This isn't easy. That's why we haven't done it. It's not hard to understand why this is difficult, and it's not hard to understand why we haven't done it before. And this is maybe a frightening statement to physical scientists. This is a social process. This involves developing new human interactions, new relationships, meeting people that you won't see at AGU. It's unfamiliar to most physical scientists, but it's absolutely essential in the Arctic, and we will not have success there, I think, unless we take this on. So now I go back to the various phases of research. Okay, what might this look like, this knowledge exchange, with these people that we haven't met yet? I think right in the planning stage, it's making sure that we hardwire the whole research process from planning through gathering the data, through analysis, through testing, validation, through communication, and out the end, they have what they need, they meaning the stakeholders. The agency's mandates have been met, and you need those stakeholders in the room when you're doing the planning of the research. If they're not there, it's almost certain that they won't get what they need. They'll get what you think they need, but that may not be what they need, and they know what they need better than you do. Observation. There's a lot of local knowledge out there. Sometimes, I think it was Erica that mentioned it this morning. Sometimes, they aren't rigorous data in the scientific sense that we're more familiar with, but they can still be made useful in many, many cases. But we don't even know what that information is out there. There's opportunities here for citizen science, and again, that was mentioned a couple of times. That's ways that these stakeholders can be engaged in the observation phase of the research. Analysis, I'm less certain about this. I think maybe this will remain the domain of the scientists to do the actual analyses, because the methodologies used can be quite complex, but I'm not sure. I can be convinced otherwise there. And then in testing and validation, oh boy, is there ever a lot there that can be used from the stakeholders directly. They have a huge amount of information that can be used. And we tie one hand behind our backs not to acknowledge that and develop means to incorporate that. And then, of course, communication. I mean, that will be another critical time that we're more familiar with, but partnered activities to exchange that information once the research has been done. And that will be so much easier if the stakeholders have been engaged in the process from the get-go. You'll be looking for the same information. And a variety of vehicles by which to do that, not necessarily the internet. What makes this hard? Well, this could be many, many slides, but the ones that I picked up on and want to hold up as fairly important here are that we don't know the people. We as the scientific community don't know many, many of the stakeholders out there, and vice versa. They don't know us. And those social relationships, those personal relationships will have to be developed. Especially the purists, the scientists that can't live without caveats, and the decision makers that can't live with caveats. We have to find common ground there. And that will be tough, but necessary. We speak very different languages. This is something that I think we recognize, and it's a difficult thing to overcome. But again, the earlier in the process they're involved, the more you will develop and share a common language through the entire scientific process. Scientific aloofness, integrity, purity. I think you know what I'm talking about. And there is that tension between research being useful for the stakeholders and retaining robustness for the scientific peers. I think those of us who sort of stepped outside the scientific community and have been speaking to the media without all the caveats know sometimes you get shot in the back by your colleagues for not layering all the caveats on. But and then time. It requires time to do this kind of engagement. This social interaction does require time. And it also just naturally takes time for these relationships to evolve. So given the fact that things are happening so urgently right now, we're behind the 8 ball and we're well behind any sort of timetable, and we've got to get going on this. And then also the rewards. The scientists aren't necessarily rewarded for this. And that's a big impediment, especially if you're early or mid-career. You're going to be writing your papers because that's how you get promoted. So I would entreat agencies and to reconsider reward structures for their own personnel, but also federal agencies perhaps to start creating some some acknowledgement vehicles so that people are rewarded for engaging in this new type of research. I can't stress that newness of this type of research enough. A new research landscape, it sure is, but it enables this co-production of knowledge between the researchers, decision makers, stakeholders, and other beneficiaries of science. Society will benefit more if we do science this way. And in the Arctic, I entreat you, we have to do it this way because of the immediacy with which the information has to be received and used. It requires sustained effort. You know, this is a sales pitch, quite honestly. We've got to get the action teams really embracing this approach, because it's not just about doing the science the old way. It's about building these new relationships, finding those stakeholders, and bringing them into the process right at the get-go. And there will be an increased societal value of this research. It's more relevant, it's valid, it's practical, it's usable, and hopefully it's actionable. That's what this is all about, I think. I think did you send out these couple of papers on knowledge to action?
They're
this
on
is
the website.
Okay, they're on the website. A couple of papers that are interesting to read. The first one by Faisy, it's more for the introduction there. But then Susan Crate, who helped me with this presentation, I meant to mention that right at the beginning, she really has lived in this world, and she'll be here after lunch. And
She's actually here now.
More. Oh, you're here. Oh, there you are. Okay.
Snuck in.
And any hard questions and experiential questions, she's done this. She knows. She knows what it takes. And with that, I'll think. Hopefully we'll have some good discussion. Thank you.
Much, Bob. You raised a lot of important points that are the reason why we're here. So let's go with that momentum now.
Thank you. That was very needed and very much appreciated. I thought that was really well presented. I think there's this social issue that you mentioned in terms of, relationships that don't currently exist. There is a parallel, I think, if we think about the progress that's been made between the modeling community and the observing community in very, very recent past. They've gotten much better about an iterative conversation that feeds each other's efforts. And I think there's a parallel there. There's been a lot of people have made efforts, a lot of people in this room, to kind of foster the kind of conversation with stakeholders that you're talking about early on in scientific investigations. One of the things I would suggest, though, that's really holding it up is it has to be iterative. And that's what's happening in the observing community and the modeling community. They keep going to the same meetings, having the same conversations. A lot of stakeholders come in and out of the picture, so we grab a representative of the indigenous community, or we grab a representative of industry, bring them to a meeting. Next meeting, you have the same observers, same modelers, different representative from the stakeholders. So somehow we have to have people who can afford to be in this conversation in this iterative fashion. Otherwise, you're kind of reinventing wheels each time you have that meeting.
Yeah, I would just say I think a lot of us in our own experiences have experienced this in one way or another. Just for me, with coming from NASA, getting the scientists and engineers together, I mean, building those relationships on a certain mission team. It's a team building exercise, and you share in the success and you share in the solutions to problems. It's not that uncommon to us, but I think when we get in, put our science hat on, often we forget how we can constructively interact with others.
Sandy first.
Yeah, thanks. I think that was a really nice encapsulation of this issue. And a couple of comments on it. One, I think getting to what Mark Serez said, there will always be the scientists. And I think we need to acknowledge that these types of practices won't be for everybody. But there are a lot of scientists who are very interested in these practices. And for those, I think we really, for the people who want to do it, we do need to acknowledge that these processes, when you look at the successful models, they're sustained, they're iterative, like Brendan said. They often include things that funding agencies are not accustomed to funding. And so I think we really need to think about the funding implications in a real way of these types of new practices, new research practices, and who the logical agencies are. Because NSF, I think, can experiment with these kinds of new research practices, but when we talk about sustained and iterative and for the long haul, that's not their mission. And so, you know, between search and certainly within IARPC, you know, how do we get the right agency program people to the table who do this stuff well and build from that?
I think, in fact, that is part of what we would like the breakout groups to consider, those issues, because I think they're paramount. You're right.
This is Erica. Can I ask a question?
Go ahead.
Sure.
So to leverage off what just I think I heard from Sandy, you know, through the SEAS program, through ARC-SEAS, we were able to support scenario planning, which is, you know, a developing science and something NSF can support that speaks to this knowledge to action. And there was a presentation by IASA at the PRB meeting about the social interaction and what users and decision makers need. Ideally, they want two choices, and if you can tell them which one of the two they should pick, that's even better. But, you know, we are exploring that, and we did try to factor that into some of this new Aon language about essentially this would be a return on investment for observing. So, you know, we're looking at different venues and different approaches because some of these approaches are going to lean on computer science, some are going to lean on the social science, natural science interaction, and others are going to be sort of like almost modeling, I'd say. But anyway, there's a lot of fundamental science that needs to be done to underpin a lot of these activities. So I think we've been responsive, but as you said, it's going to take some time for this to grow. But I really do appreciate your presentation.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
So, yeah, Bob, good job. It's interesting as a social scientist to hear this presented in the context of physical science. And I know some colleagues are here, Sherry and Henry, at least I know, have done a lot of work with communities. And just a little bit of background on what we did was that, you know, our knowledge exchange evolved out of doing interviews and focus groups, focusing on what kind of change people were actually observing. So this really posits local communities as scientists, and with a very specific place-based type of expertise. All their lives they've been observing the cycles and the daily and annual trends. And so in the knowledge exchange, that was one of the first things we did, was to invite audience participants to talk about that in a way to value that expertise. And I collaborated with Alexander Fyodorov, my co-author on the paper, and because, well, it was interesting because we were halfway into, we did 8 knowledge exchanges in the regional centers and then in the villages where we did the actual research. And halfway through, he told me he had never presented his scientific findings to this kind of an audience, number one. And he had never presented it in his native language, the Saha language. It had always been in Russian. It had always been at these big, highfalutin scientific meetings, which was eye-opening for me. But I think, you know, we also have to think about the other ways in which these knowledge exchanges not only can affect local people's understanding of global change, right, which in many ways is out of their really toolbox of understanding their world, even though they're observing and knowing that something's happening locally. And many people are aware, those in these local communities who read extensively. But it can also affect the scientists we work with in these local areas, because they also realize that they have a role in this too. And I also wanted to mention at the very beginning, I think we had a mention of this local and scientific knowledge. And I know that this is very arbitrary, you know, there's these two kinds of knowledge, blah, blah, blah. But for just the sake of discussion, it's important, I think, to just think about it that way. And since you're talking so much about scientists and what scientists do, and I think there's, in the social science world, this is not a new thing. It's relatively new, but it's not brand new. And it's come a long way because, you know, if we think about co-management, all these other efforts to actually work with local communities with the idea that local communities are there and they've been there for a long time and they know what we're looking at. You know, they are keepers of their area, more or less. So I wanted to mention that, and that's probably it for now. But I also brought with me a copy. You know, after these 8 knowledge exchanges, we were trying to figure out how we could maybe emulate this for everyone else in the Vlui regions. And because the internet is so slow there and people don't usually use it, we created this book in the local language, in the Saha language, which tries to emulate this knowledge exchange process. And so if anybody wants to look at that, it's got a lot of pictures in it. So thank you.
Okay,
Oh yeah, I meant to mention, when I read your paper, that was that pictures, I think I put it on the bullet there, but I didn't emphasize it. Pictures can be an extremely effective way of communicating with people when you don't share the language. Yeah.
All right. Okay, we're running late on time. One last comment before we wrap it up with Hayo.
Just as the microphone comes over to her, Susan, I would bet your colleague there, when he mentioned that he had never given that kind of presentation to that audience in his own native language, he said that with a great deal of satisfaction that he had done that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's very gratifying. Yeah, yeah. It opens a whole new dimension to your science. Yeah.
Oh, just a quick comment, and to get back to something to reinforce what Sandy had mentioned about sustained, the agencies, and I don't know what all the agencies do, but just to speak to some of the things that NOAA has done, have had this problem for a long time, and it's a challenge. And so they've come up with some mechanisms to deal with it, things like regional teams, you know, ones that are focused on only working with regions and their stakeholders. They do this in Gulf of Mexico for coastal wetlands. They do this in the Northeast U.S. for, you know, the lobster fisheries and things like that. So there's one devoted to Alaska. How well any of these work or not is not my purview, but I think that the fact that they have existed for a long time and been pushing exactly what that issue is might be something to maybe either contribute towards or at least understand a little bit of. The other mechanisms are things like what we call the RISAs, that are regional information services. So there's one for the Southwest that deals with drought. There's one in Alaska that deals also with this kind of thing of working specifically with that region for stakeholders, and that one's more for products and information. So I think that it just would be productive to understand some of the things that are already in place and to see how search, you know, through the action teams, how they can contribute to filling some of the gaps that aren't addressed by those efforts that are already underway. And then I guess I would say that maybe it would be productive to work this also through the IARPIC teams, because it's through the agencies that specific information that is mandated to be provided to stakeholders is where that lies. Yeah. So versus maybe coming up with, you know, just a collection of things, you might start by saying we can do better by partnering with so-and-so agency because they're responsible for providing this information to specific stakeholders.
I see agencies as stakeholders as well, yeah. But use what's already out there. Yeah, it's not a new problem. People have been banging their head against this wall for a while, and there has been a few bricks fall out of it.